Okay, so good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dylan Kassane. I'm on the marketing team here at Inova. We're a biopharma cloud platform for accelerating partnering. And in 2020, we presented our first virtual partnering event series. And now, together with BIO and in partnership with Evaluate, we're happy to be presenting our first virtual partnering event of 2021. We're excited to be welcoming some of the best biotechs and biopharma companies that together are breaking new ground and that are advancing their oncology pipelines at our event this week. Now, before we get started, just a couple of logistics. Everybody is on mute right now to minimize the background noise during the webinar. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into that Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. And lastly, of course, this webinar is going to be recorded. So when we're done, we'll send you a link to the recording and you'll be able to share that with your colleagues who might be in partnering meetings right now or might be back at the office. So today on the call, we're joined by two experts, Paul Verdin and Henry Barling. Paul Verdin is the head of custom solutions at Evaluate, a leading bespoke forecasting, valuation, and industry assessment projects for early stage biotechs, large pharma, and industry supplier organizations. Henry Barling is our senior oncology analyst at Evaluate, focused on market and patient-based forecasting, asset valuation, and competitive intelligence for companies of all sizes within the oncology landscape. And of course, there's myself, Dylan, to tell you a little bit about Inova before I hand over to Paul and Henry in just a minute or two. So, who are we at Inova? Since 2010, we've provided a cloud platform to help the entire biopharma industry accelerate partnering. Our clients use our technology to identify future partners, accelerate deal making, and successfully manage their alliances. Inova is the market leader in cloud-based partnering software for all life science professionals managing licensing, research collaborations, and M&A activities. Over half of the top 50 pharma and hundreds of biotech use our platform every day. And within that platform, there's a module known as one-on-one partnering, which facilitates hundreds of thousands of one-to-one meetings every year at large life science conferences worldwide, like the BIO International Convention, which is the largest business partnering event in the world. Last year, it also supported BIO Digital and our own virtual partnering event series. And of course, it's the module you're using here at Virtual Partnering Oncology. This event today is the first of two that are dedicated to oncology this year, with the second event in late September. We're hosting two other events as part of our series this year, Virtual Partnering Immunology, which gets underway next week, and Virtual Partnering Neuroscience in October. If you or others on your team are interested in registering for one of these events, you can find all the information on the central event website, virtualpartnering.com, where you registered for the oncology event we're attending today. And now I'm happy to hand over to Paul and to Henry and to get underway with this special session from Evaluate. Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks Dylan. And likewise, good morning, evening, afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us here. I hope the session is interesting and informative for you. So you can see the title on screen here. Henry and I will be speaking about calculating risk and return in oncology development. So next slide, please, Dylan. So before we get started, maybe I'll just give a bit of context to who we are and what we'll be talking to you about today. So for those of you who don't know us, Evaluate is a leading provider of commercial intelligence to the pharma industry, and we've been around for around 25 years. Evaluate Pharma and Evaluate Omnium are our two flagship subscription products that are the primary ways clients engage with us. And really, I guess our claim to fame, or key data set people know us for, are our consensus forecasts of equity analyst models. So we'll certainly be showing you some data today that's derived from the platform, and I'll give you a bit of context to that on the first slide. But Henry and I are in the Henry and I are in the custom solutions group at Evaluate, and we work with clients of all different shapes and sizes, from major pharma to pre-revenue biotechs, industry suppliers, advisors, investors, to support our clients with their R&D and commercial strategy decision making. So we build our projects on a foundation of evaluate content. So in terms of what I hope you will get from the session today, you can see on the screen here. So I'm going to take the first session and give some analysis and hopefully insights into macro trends and market forecasts in oncology using a foundation of that evaluate data that I described. And in the second half, I'll hand over to Henry. He will give perspectives on frameworks and analysis methodologies to best quantify risk and return dynamics in oncology markets. So next slide, please, Dylan. All right, so to get started then with some data, this first slide here is showing the total pharma industry from a full aggregated view in terms of sales from 2015 through to 2026. So you can see on the chart here. And I think the first key message to highlight here is that pharma is in a very healthy place. So in the recent past, from 2015 through to 2020, you can see that the industry top line grew by 4.4% compound annual growth rate. And that is forecast to accelerate out to 2026, up to 7.3% compound annual growth rate. And what this data from Evaluate Pharma here is showing is that the forecast for the industry as a whole is to be a $1.2 trillion market in 2026, which is obviously a fantastic headline. And just to provide a bit of context of the data again, as per my previous slide, in these analyses, I'll show any historical years. This is based on company reported data, and any future years, this is based on that consensus of sell-side analyst models that I described. So I think the second key point to highlight here, and if you look at the segments on the chart, is that it's really innovation that's driving that growth story for pharma. So the purple segment here on this chart is, if you like, older established products and the sales generated by those products, which is slightly set to decline out to 2026, I guess, sort of intuitively in some ways. The lighter blue, this is more recently launched products that entered the market in 2015 or later. And then red, this is pipeline, so it's R&D pipeline products. And hopefully you can tell that sort of wedge, if you like, of blue and red is the segment that is driving that growth story. So a wave of innovation across therapy areas, and actually that segment of new, if you like, and novel products is forecast to make up more than 50% of the pharma market by 2026. So next slide, please, Darren. Of course, the focus of this whole conference and the session today is on oncology, so I'll zoom in on that now. And this next slide here is showing that growth rate. So across the x-axis, this is the historical growth rates, and on the y, that's the forecast future growth rate for the different therapeutic area segments that we have in Evaluate Pharma. So first key message to highlight here is that all therapy areas are forecast for positive growth out to 2026, with the exception of, as you can see at the bottom there, musculoskeletal. This space is forecast to display negative growth out to 2026, driven largely, or in very large part, by the decline of Humira on biosimilar challenge. But if we look up in the right-hand corner, top right-hand corner, these are segments that are consistent growth drivers for the industry. And you can see oncology up there as a sort of shining beacon in green. Oncology is the biggest segment of the pharma market, and also a consistent double-digit growth driver for the industry. We can also see dermatology up there, which is the only sort of contender, if you like, in growth terms, but growing from a much smaller base. So what this analysis from Evaluate Pharma here is showing is that oncology is forecast to be a $330 billion market in 2026. And that's a growth from around 13% of the industry as a whole in 2015 to more than a quarter, so 27% of the market in 2026. And actually in 2026, Keytruda and Opdivo will be the two biggest selling products globally, according to Evaluate Pharma, with combined sales of over $40 billion. And if we zoom in on that oncology story a little, in 2026, the PD-1s will be the biggest market segment and also the biggest growth drivers. The PD-1 market will be worth more than $48 billion at that time. And that segment is followed up by a whole host of other mechanistic classes, the PD-L1s, CDK inhibitors, BTK inhibitors. And indeed, Evaluate Pharma lists more than 300 discrete biological mechanisms that are forecast for positive growth in oncology through to 2026. And I would sort of return to the title, I guess, of the session, which is calculating risk and return in oncology development. And it's clear here that return can be substantial, and we're talking primarily commercial return here, of course, but return in terms of improvement in patient outcomes undoubtedly in oncology has been very, very strong. But I think a cautionary note, and sort of to set the scene for some of the later slides, the bottom bullet on the left, the growth in the oncology market is forecast to slow slightly to 2026. So from 14% CAGR in the recent past, down to about 12.6 out to 2026. And looking into the data, there are a few drivers, kind of standout drivers of that. We've got Revlimid, for example, with a sharp decline on genericization, as well as the sort of I guess similar, biosimilarization, if you like, of the the original or older mAb classes of Herceptin, Avastin, Rituxan, which are also set to decline. So very positive growth story, but with some cautionary notes. Next slide, please, Dylan. And that focus on mechanistic classes, I just want to pick up and sort of use as a nice segue into this next slide here. And this chart is showing the makeup of the oncology market, again in that 2015 to 2026 timeframe, broken down by underlying modality. So the key headline here, I think, is that oncology is diversifying. So diversifying away from chemo and mAbs, the kind of traditional mAbs, into more targeted therapeutics. And you can see the purple and red segments here represent small molecules and mAbs. And back in 2015, that combined segment, if you like, was over 90%, in fact, close to 95% of the oncology market by sales. But that is forecast to shrink, if you like, in market share terms to 2026 to around about 80% by that time. And you can see some new colors sort of being introduced in the top right-hand corner of the chart there. And these represent novel next generation therapeutics. So we have cell therapies, gene therapies, RNA-based therapeutics, as well as genome editing, generating forecasts by that time. And you can see in the notes on the bottom right there that next generation therapeutic segment is forecast to generate around 20 billion, just over $20 billion of sales in 2026, which is just over 6% of the overall pharma market. So of course, what we have seen in oncology is a real shift towards more targeted therapeutics driven by a bigger or a better understanding, should I say, of the underlying biology of disease. And you can see that reflected in the numbers here, I think. Next slide, please, Tim. So I just want to switch focus on this slide and look less at mechanistic trends and look more into the underlying indications and take more of a disease focus within the oncology market. And just to orientate everyone on this chart here, this is showing on the x-axis the number of products in oncology on the market today, effectively in 2020, with sales in Evaluate Pharma. And then on the y-axis, this is how many products are forecasted to be on the market in 2026, generating sales. And the bubble size here is the size of the market in 2026 dollar terms. So you can see here that NSCLC is forecast to be the biggest disease state in oncology in sales terms in 2026. And that's somewhere around a $48 billion market in 2026. You can also see some other pretty major cancer markets highlighted here, like breast, multiple myeloma, prostate, and the broad NHL category. But a key take home, I think, from this slide is just the sheer growth or increase in the number of products on the market in oncology, according to this analysis. So it's a 75% increase overall. And if you look, say, taking NSCLC as an example, you can see that we have somewhere just under 30 products on the market today versus a forecast prediction of maybe around 60 in 2026. So pretty much a doubling of the number of therapeutic options on the market. Now, clearly not all assets currently in R&D are actually going to make it to the market. Some of them will fail in development. But what I think this slide is indicative of is another key trend that we've seen in oncology, which is even greater segmentation and dissection of patient populations based on a much improved understanding of the underlying biology of disease, which of course is great for patients. If new treatments enter the market that are targeted and have much better outcomes in terms of efficacy, as well as a much cleaner tolerability profile, then that's fantastic. That's what everyone would like to see. But I think it does pose challenges for drug developers and business development professionals alike, because it becomes increasingly difficult to fully articulate the risk-return profile around an asset, particularly earlier in development, given that the backdrop is so dynamic. So it becomes increasingly difficult, I think, to pick winners against such a dynamic backdrop. Next slide, please, Dylan. I've got one more slide of data here before I wrap up on my section. And shifting focus from revenue to focus more on R&D metrics. This chart is showing indication categorizations from Evaluate Pharma, actually Evaluate Omnium, should I say in this case, according to some R&D metrics. And you can see over on the left, we've got a table of developmental success rates, in the middle, trial or developmental costs, and then over on the right, R&D development timelines. And I think, a take-home message from this slide is, of course, that developing oncology therapeutics just isn't easy. So in cost terms, oncology is a relatively expensive space in which to develop new pharmaceuticals. In terms of timelines, cancer or oncology is not one of the quicker development areas, should we say, to get products to the market. But in particular, in terms of success rates, oncology has demonstrated historically quite low success rates for development of only 10%. So only 1 in 10 assets entering phase 1 would be expected to reach the market. So against a backdrop of dynamic competitive landscapes, and with these metrics in mind, it's a very exciting time in oncology, but undoubtedly a very challenging one as well. Next slide, please, Dylan. So I'll just close my session with a quick summary of some of the things that I've told you about today. So oncology is a major driver of growth for the industry, forecast to make up more than 25% of the market in 2026. Innovation is revolutionizing outcomes for patients, and driven by a greater understanding of the biology of disease and more granular segmentation of populations and targeting of treatments. But it's that dynamism in the landscape, coupled with intense competition, that I think makes fully understanding and having deep insight into product positioning and differentiation an absolute necessity. And that's from a developmental perspective, development strategy perspective, but of course also from a BD perspective as well. And from us, from our side, we believe a number of key research methodologies and frameworks should be applied when conducting that kind of work. And in the second section here, Henry will pick up where I've left off and talk through some of those ideas. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I am just going to jump in with a couple of questions that people have submitted now. And of course, you can continue to do that right through the session in the Q&A box just at the bottom there. We'll get to them as they come through, but there are a couple that have come in for you already, Paul, that I'm hoping you can just speak to. The first, well, there are 2 questions really, I'll try and combine them, is around the growth in the oncology market space, which is to say it's going from 14% to 12%, but it's still outpacing the industry. The question is this really something we should be worried about? And the second part of that question, or the second question is, why is it slowing down?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try. So I think obviously a 12.6% compound annual growth rate is a fantastic outlook for sure. So I wouldn't say this is necessarily something to worry about. Of course, it's still suggestive of a high degree of growth in the market. And again, in commercial terms, notwithstanding clinical and patient perspectives. But I think why is it declining? I think, as I mentioned, there are a couple of negative growth drivers in the data there, in terms of the older mAbs, some of the small molecule therapeutics like Revlimid that are big revenue generators but set to decline. But I think also, there's been a huge growth story driven through immuno-oncology in recent years. And I don't think there is such a big growth story baked into the forecast at this stage for other modalities. So from a data perspective, I think those are some of the things that are underlying those numbers.
And another question here was, all of these metrics that you're showing around R&D, can you talk to how they're actually calculated, things like success rates and costs? How does Evaluate actually come up with that data?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, Henry and I can't take the credit for that. We didn't do any of that work, but our product people have been busy. So, Evaluate Omnium is the product that I mentioned up at the start, and this product has more of a focus on R&D metrics, and I guess the risk rather than return side of the equation. And a lot of the metrics that I showed there, the cycle times, the success rates, the development costs, these were built up with the archive of data that we've been storing at Evaluate for the last at least decade. So they're all driven from historical observations and modeling from historical observations. Yeah.
Okay. I've just got one last question that's come in before we pass over to you, Henry. And that is, with such an increase in the size and the rate of the oncology market, do you expect a decrease in the prices of oncology products, or do you expect the prices to rest steady?
Mm-hmm. Very difficult question, right? So I don't have a solid answer for that, but I think, as markets get more segmented, I guess, and, therefore it actually becomes potentially easier in inverted commas to demonstrate the value of a product if outcomes are improving, then that's a very positive thing, right? But in the grand scheme of things, can pharma prices keep increasing forever? I don't know. It's going to be an interesting one, and I think some of the recent highly innovative products like CAR T, for example, and some of the early gene therapies that have been launched outside oncology as well, have started to test some of the pricing models, I think. So I don't have an answer either way, unfortunately, but it's going to be a fascinating one to watch, I think.
Fantastic. Well, there I can see that there's a couple more coming in, but I want to make sure that we get through Henry's part of the presentation as well. So Henry, will pass over to you. I'll just move forward on that slide. And Henry, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Dylan. Yeah, so just following on from Paul's macro view on the oncology landscape, I'm going to give a bit of I'm going to focus a little bit more on how we can use data-driven approaches and strategies when thinking about oncology assets to assess risk and return opportunities. So forecasting within oncology requires a strong understanding of target assets and the markets within which they operate. We can leverage data in a number of different ways in order to aid our understanding of these markets and paint a better picture of how this asset is likely to operate in the future. In this discussion, I'm going to be focusing more heavily on the patient-based market sizing elements outlined in this toolkit here. So the first three sections. But if you have any questions on competitive landscape or product positioning, then obviously don't hesitate to send those questions through, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks, Tim. Perfect. Okay, so oncology markets present quite unique challenges, which are not always seen in other therapeutic areas. And understanding these challenges and navigating them effectively is vital to assessing asset performance. I'm not going to highlight everything that we've outlined here as a challenge when modeling within oncology, but here's kind of general list of things which can make assessing value a little more difficult. Now, the first one I just want to kind of touch on briefly is maybe less of an issue for this audience, because it seems as though most people would be a lot more familiar with the area, given it's an oncology-based conference. But oncology has a lot of technical jargon associated with it, particularly when reviewing secondary literature and how physicians, clinical algorithms, so how physicians are looking at patients. It can be difficult to understand a lot of the terminology that's used. And sometimes that can just make it a very arduous process to kind of understand a new disease area. And as I'm going to outline, getting to grips with a disease area can be really key to understanding commercial opportunities within the space. Data or patient-based data is often reported as incidents within oncology. And as cancers are progressive diseases, patients who receive a diagnosis often receive a number of different treatment options before they progress into the systemic treatment eligible pools of patients, which drug products are usually targeted towards. And therefore, we need to kind of understand how we can convert, or how we can look at patients from incidents into those systemically treated pools. As Paul's outlined in his macro analysis, investment in cancer R&D has been very high historically and very well rewarded as well, and it's likely to remain very high for the foreseeable future. This has resulted in a landscape which is changing rapidly, and clinical landscapes are often extremely dynamic. The treatment options available to patients are progressing quite quickly. Markets have become a lot more niche. Again, as Paul touched upon, products are becoming more targeted to smaller patient populations where they can drive better clinical outcomes. Understanding the size of the unmet needs within a target product's core patient segments is vital to assessing the commercial returns of assets. And finally, so by leveraging flow models, which follow patients from incidents through their clinical journey, using treatment duration and outcome parameters, we can better identify how many patients are sitting within our target therapeutic segments, and better understand how many patients are available to be treated with our product of interest. So I've touched upon some of the kind of broader challenges associated with forecasting in oncology. And now I'm just going to focus on some of the methodologies we can use to kind of address a few of those issues. As products within oncology have become increasingly niche, clearly defining and understanding the treatment eligible population is vital to assessing commercial opportunity. So in a very simplistic way, patients times by share times by price equals sales when we're running a forecast. So patient numbers act as one of three kind of key linear drivers of sales in a forecast. So if we double the number of patients in our market, then we double the number of sales. Therefore, it's kind of one of those key parameters we really want to nail down and get right when we're assessing the value or when we're assessing a potential commercial opportunity. So poor understanding can lead to poor decision-making here, obviously. So an overestimate of the market size is going to lead to overpayment on assets, and underestimating the market size is just going to mean we miss out on opportunities which were potentially could have been significant value drivers for us. So just on the right here, I've included a diagram to illustrate some of the key segmentation types we encounter quite often in oncology. And some of those you might want to think about when sizing up new opportunities. So obviously we start with incidence, so the top line epidemiology, as it were, for a cancer. And then the first segmentation layer I've pulled in here is histopathology, in this case, adenocarcinoma. So some cancers have quite varied therapeutic options available to patients based on the types of cell which form the tumor. If there are differences in how patients are being treated based on the histopathology, then this is definitely something we want to factor into our patient segmentation. It may be that certain histopathologies are better treated than others, or respond better to currently available treatments, and that can also be a vital consideration in the forecast. The next one I've highlighted here is staging. So if a therapy is administered prior to a metastatic setting, for example, in an adjuvant setting, you may want to restrict your target population to those who are non-metastatic, because you know that your product isn't going to be given to patients outside of those or in those metastatic settings. And alternatively, if you have a product which is licensed within, or you expect to get a license within a metastatic setting, then understanding the number of patients who are metastatic, both at diagnosis, so say typically what would be your stage 4 patients, and also how many patients are progressing from these lower stages of disease is going to be very important to understanding what your potential market size might be. The next one here is one that Paul's touched upon again, but so biomarker expression. So increasingly within cancer labels, we're seeing a requirement for a positive test or a minimum expression level of a given biomarker before a patient receives a product. So understanding both the expression level within the population and also anticipated treatment rates. So how many patients get tested for given biomarkers in a condition already? Is this a biomarker that is currently being tested for? That can be vital to understanding the size of the market as well, because even if you had like 50% of patients expressing a biomarker, if only 50% are getting tested for it, then you're not going to know about half of those patients that you would otherwise be able to pick up. So they're two kind of vital considerations as well. And then finally, the last one is treatment eligibility. So can patients tolerate available treatment options in the setting? And also, is your product likely to change the number of patients that could tolerate treatment? So are you likely to drive a change there? And the same could again be said of biomarker testing. So testing rates may be low, but if your product is fantastic and drives significant clinical benefit, then are you actually going to drive up the number of tests being done? Okay, so dynamic flow modeling mapped to clinical management algorithms allows us to accurately size target oncology populations. Oncology indications are highly dynamic. Best practice is often well-defined through something like the NCCN guidelines, but these are often constantly evolving, as Paul mentioned, and I've touched upon as well. These are highly dynamic spaces typically, and things do change quickly. Treatment of patients is progressive. A patient who is early stage at diagnosis may progress into metastatic settings. And due to the progressive nature of disease, disease events occurring upstream of a target setting can have significant impacts on downstream settings. So if you can imagine, I've included here the clinical management algorithm. Here you can see something like the late stage adjuvant patients, for example. If we drive, if there was a new adjuvant therapy in these late stage adjuvant patients, which significantly increased the curative potential of adjuvant therapy here, then potentially we can reduce the number of patients who are progressing from that late stage adjuvant bucket through into the second line therapy at the bottom there. By taking a holistic view of our market, we can better understand and incorporate the impact of events occurring outside of our direct target pool of patients, and we can really understand events that otherwise we may have overlooked. So when considering risk, it's important to assess events kind of across the market and how they interplay with your target settings. Next one, please, Dylan. Thanks. Okay, so treatment duration has become a major driver of value within oncology. So in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a real shift away from cycled therapies towards more treatment to progression. And this just means rather than having a defined length of treatment cycles, number of treatment cycles before a physician makes a decision on next treatment, or patients are then monitored for progression. Now, typically what we see is that drugs are given until a patient progresses. And that just means that the volume of the product used is now generally tied to how well a product achieves tumor control. Since approvals and regulatory submissions often include PFS, so progression-free survival, as a primary endpoint in studies, new therapies often do extend this duration of response to treatment. Increasing duration of treatment is obviously going to drive an increase in the volume of the product utilized. So it's an important consideration. So how how much more product is going to be utilized within this line of therapy, given that my product is going to extend PFS by 2 months, is an important consideration for like directly assessing the return. But it can also have an impact on products operating downstream. So if we have a novel product launching, potentially that can slow the flow of patients progressing into these downstream settings. And here I've just included the classic kind of epidemiologist bathtub. It's usually used to describe incidence and prevalence and the interplay between the two. But here I've kind of co-opted it a little bit to look at the number of patients receiving treatment within a line of therapy. So if you can imagine in a bathtub, the level of the water in the tub represents the number of patients receiving therapy at any given time. And this is a strange bathtub because we've got patients coming in at the top, so the tap's open and the sink is open as well. So patients are leaving through the bottom. So patients entering the treatment pool are coming through the tap at the top. So this is the number initiating therapy. Patients leave the tub as they discontinue treatment. So if we extend the amount of time that patients receive treatment, the level of water in the pool is going to rise over time, because fewer patients are discontinuing treatment. So that fewer patients are leaving through the bottom until obviously the new equilibrium is reached. If we think about lines of therapy as being many of these linked bathtubs, if that makes sense. So first line sits above second line, sits above third line. Then as duration of treatment increases in the first line setting, say due to a new product launch, the number of patients flowing into second or third line can potentially decrease based on the increased uptake of this novel product, delaying the progression into subsequent lines of therapy. Okay, so pan-tumor or tumor agnostic forecasting is an emerging treatment paradigm within oncology, and it does add quite significant complexity, I guess, when we consider forecasting return for these assets. So on the right-hand side here, I've just included a cumulative count of phase 2 to 3 trials investigating tumor agnostic indications from 2013 to 2020, and as we can see, it's kind of there have been more and more trials investigated over time. So in 2018, Vitrakvi was approved as the first pure play kind of pan-tumor or tumor agnostic therapeutic targeting NTRK. In 2017, Keytruda was actually approved for MMR deficient patients, but it had obviously received a number of different approvals prior to that MMR approval. So this was the first kind of real pure play product to get approval in this kind of setting. And as we can imagine, forecasting oncology encounters many of the same challenges we see within forecasting within pan-tumor indications encounters many of the same challenges seen within other oncology indications. But now obviously we are just looking at kind of many more indications, so potentially like 20, 25 tumor types, whereas before we may have been looking at just the 1 or 2. And most cancers do have significant unmet need, obviously. Most of these are very acute conditions, but even within cancers, the landscape of unmet need is quite variable. So while some cancers like hormone-sensitive prostate cancer are generally relatively treatable, others such as glioblastoma are still kind of incredibly difficult to treat. So when we're considering the uptake of a product across these kind of diverse range of settings, it's important to consider the clinical landscape that the product is operating in. So you may be less likely to drive increased uptake in something like hormone-sensitive prostate cancer, where hormone therapies are quite cheap and generally effective, whereas in GBM, where there aren't many other options, clinicians might be more likely to use your product. So duration of response is heavily impacted by patient prognosis. So this is within lines of therapy, but also within different tumor types. So in first line, a patient's likely to be more responsive than one in third line, but also, as mentioned above, like in prostate cancer, you might be receive treatment for longer, whereas GBM patients are probably not receiving treatment for very long. Understanding how this differs is going to be vital. Factoring that into the forecast is vital when assessing opportunities, particularly when looking at products that are licensed as treatment to progression. Probably less important when it comes to cycled therapies, because there's less of a direct tie between volume use and patient response. And then finally, kind of standards of care can vary wildly across different tumor types. So in ovarian cancer, for example, the standard of care is platinum-based chemo, whereas in NSCLC, it's often Keytruda, depending on the line we're looking at. And this can make price benchmarking quite difficult, because there aren't standardized comparators for every condition. Instead, we're kind of building out a picture based on many different pricing benchmarking environments and standard of care comparators. So that can be a significant challenge here. While attempting to understand asset value across such a diverse range of settings can be quite daunting, by breaking it down into the kind of settings and target populations this product is going to be targeted to, and leveraging these methodologies to get a clearer understanding of how and where we can pick up patients, it is possible to get a much better understanding of the asset potentials, even when considering these broad asset indications. And then just to kind of wrap up my section, I just wanted to kind of circle back to this toolkit that we outlined at the start, and kind of run you through how these are relevant to forecasting within oncology. So clearly defining your eligible patient population allows you to kind of identify key features and segmentation of your products, and really better understand the targetable patient pool you're going to be able to address. A strong understanding of the clinical algorithm allows us to better understand what patients are currently receiving across the market, and how physicians see and treat these patients, again, so whether that's likely to change in the future as well. Having a holistic view of the patient flow dynamics and how kind of patients progress through these different market segments enables us to better understand events outside of direct competition, and how those will impact our asset performance. So it enables us to kind of have a bit more of a 360 vision on the market, and not get, hit by something we didn't necessarily see coming, because we weren't aware of changes happening in different market segments outside of the one we're directly operating in. So insight into the constantly evolving competitive landscape. So understanding current and future treatment options, and quantifying the probability of events occurring, as well as the impact they have on our return, is going to be vital to assessing the risk-reward profile of assets. And then finally, so robust understanding of asset positioning and differentiation. So clearly defining the target therapeutic profiles, and understanding the value proposition our asset represents in comparison to the currently available and few products which will be available at the time of launch of our asset, is going to be vital for us to actually develop assumptions on product uptake. And it will help us to ensure that we don't have unrealistic expectations of product share capture within any of these markets, because as I'm sure many of you will be aware, when you're looking at something and you've been looking at it for a while, you can tend to develop potentially some unrealistic assumptions around how significant the opportunity is. But by breaking it down and really looking at it versus the competitors, we can get a much clearer picture. So I think that's everything from me. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Henry. So I'll jump back in here and just say thanks to everyone for joining. I'm sure Dylan will have a few more questions for us, but certainly if you'd like to get in touch with us and talk more about what we do, or have any further questions about the slides we've shown, then please do get in touch. So you've got contact details for myself up on screen here, and our website. So thank you very much for joining again and for listening.
Yeah, we certainly do have a few questions, Paul and Henry. Thanks, Henry. I'm just going to go to those questions in a second, but if there are still more questions coming through, do pop them in that Q&A box. If we have time, we'll get to them, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. The first question that I have here actually came in while we were talking with you, Henry. Henry, the question is, have you seen any differences in your risk and return model across different lines of therapy?
Okay, so that's a pretty interesting question. So often products tend to launch in lower lines of therapy, in second or third line, say, and then potentially move up the treatment algorithm based on kind of new clinical evidence, or as they become better established in the setting. When it comes to return, so we've often kind of sized these downstream markets whilst also looking at the market from a more holistic view, as I've kind of pointed to earlier. So we've already kind of assessed the market size of the upstream settings as well. So we can kind of leverage that those aspects of our modeling in order to look at the upstream settings in the same way that we're looking at those downstream settings as well. And the unmet need landscape kind of across different lines of therapies can be quite variable when we're looking at different lines of therapy as well. So a factor here would be how different is the unmet needs between different lines of therapy. Are we likely to drive further uptake in one line of therapy versus another? And then also, I guess there's some consideration around share cannibalization as well. So would moving between settings or having a product license for multiple settings in the same kind of market, does that diminish sales in different settings? So as we increase use in one line of therapy, does that diminish the sales generated in a different line of therapy, or are patients actually re-challenging? And that's an interesting consideration, particularly when it comes to cycled therapies. I think less so with treatment to progression, because you're unlikely to re-challenge with something a patient's already progressed on. And then I guess when it comes to risk, we tend to kind of look at events that are occurring across the market landscape. But kind of when it's looking at when we're looking at risk for this kind of changes in lines of therapy, I guess that the main risk is going to be the cost of developing that new evidence to launch further up the algorithm, and the probability of success of actually making it to market in that versus the commercial return. So it's just making sure we're comfortable with that risk and reward profile if we do decide to pursue other lines of therapy, I guess.
That's great. I have another question, which I think is from one of your slides, Henry, where you mentioned an increasing cost of therapies. What's driving the increasing cost? Is it R&D? Is it something closer to the end user? Can you speak to what's driving that increase?
It's difficult to say. I think what we have typically seen is that these more targeted therapies coming into the market have been driving increased costs. Now, whether that's down to kind of the fact that they're operating in a more niche segment, and again, as Paul alluded to, they have better clinical outcomes in those settings, so potentially you have a better argument when it comes to value. Not 100%. It's something we've observed, and I would probably point to that kind of the increased segmentation mixed with better outcomes. And again, that R&D is always going to have an impact as well, because if it costs more to develop the drugs, companies are going to want to charge more to kind of generate that return.
Okay, I have another question, a little bit more open-ended, and Paul, it might be a little bit closer to you. The question is just, can you speak for a moment about discount rates for pharma and for biotech?
Discount rates in terms of a forecast model, like an MPV model? Is that?
I would imagine so. I've just got the question there. If Tim, if you want to expand on that in the Q&A box, I'm happy to fill Paul in.
Sure. I'm not sure I'll have a lot to say. I'll certainly let Henry jump in if he has more. But when we build forecasts and then want to convert those to a valuation, with a sort of typical NPV, we would apply a discount rate, of course. In our Evaluate database, we do have an NPV module, so we have some methodologies we sometimes lean on there, or we'll basically build a model to a client specification and discuss the discount rate with the client at that point in time. But Henry, I don't know if you've got anything specific to add.
No, I didn't have anything to add over the top of
Okay.
that.
So the clarification there is: do you calculate disease-specific rates?
Okay, I'm not aware that we have in a project in the past, but I'm pretty sure we could. But we haven't done that to date. Now we've typically built models, with editable frameworks as well, actually. So not to labour too much on this kind of point, but we generally produce an output that a client can then pick up and take on and do more things with, including editing things like discount rates if they'd like to.
Okay. Henry, you spoke a bit about the target population and how knowing that target population is so important. Obviously, we could use Evaluate to help us learn more about the size of this target population. But the question I have is who's actually using these sorts of tools to identify those sorts of statistics? Is it pharma? Is it biotechs? Is it VC? Is it everyone?
Yeah, I think, interesting. So I think everyone can leverage these tools. Whether they do or not is a different matter, I guess. But from kind of a biotech perspective, if you're looking to kind of out-license products or kind of partner with pharma, then it makes sense to have a clear understanding of what your potential valuation is for this product. And in order to get that, particularly with kind of pipeline assets, it can be useful to understand from a patient-based perspective, kind of what's my total addressable market? So what does it look like if I treated everyone? What does that look like? And then we can kind of go from there and build out specific business cases of what am I likely to get. So it's definitely kind of across the board. Again, with pharma, if they're looking to kind of value assets or understand what makes sense in terms of a good deal, then having a clear understanding of what the market potential is for different assets is going to be vital. And one of the core ways to do that in those kind of early pipeline assets in particular would be to focus on that patient-based understanding and build out an understanding of potential commercial value from there.
Okay. We have a question, and the question is quite long, so I'm going to try and pass a little bit and pull it together. In general, it sounds like to our questioner like they're almost incredulous that someone wouldn't do a market study or wouldn't look at this total addressable market for a therapy. Is it that it's not being done, or that it's not being done effectively? And if it's not being done effectively, what are some of the mistakes that people make?
Sorry, could I just hear that one again? I don't think I caught all of that.
I guess the idea is the question seems to suggest that almost they can't believe that nobody would be looking at their target population or the potential impact that a new therapy would have. Is it that it's not being done at all, or is it that people are doing it but they're making errors in determining how large this addressable market might be?
Yeah, so I think most people have a general understanding that this information is important. So you should be trying to understand your total addressable population. I think what we've kind of seen in the past from some clients is kind of a disconnect between maybe understanding what their target population should be, but not taking the appropriate steps in order to better quantify that. So sometimes like companies may rely on, say, incidence as a surrogate measure, and maybe not build in the necessary granularity in order to actually assess. You know, when I talk about that kind of patient segmentation, I'm really looking at kind of honing in on kind of the clinical evidence that's been generated, and translating that into a segment of the population which we can actually hit. And it's not that people aren't doing it, it's just making sure that when you are doing it, you're approaching it through the kind of lens of how do I need to segment the overall population to get down to my specific niche, and making sure that we're approaching it and doing it with the correct level of granularity.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question, so I'm going to try and pick one here that comes back to you, Paul. Paul, the question is, you've got oncology growing to about 25% of the pharma market, so it's really important, but it seems to be focused on a couple of major tumor types as the most important. What does that mean for biotechs researching outside of these tumor types?
Yeah, well, I think you know, certainly that there is a lot of market opportunity everywhere, right? So that headline trend for oncology is a very strong one. But yeah, you're right. The chart does show a sort of convergence, if you like, of efforts, you know, and into specific niches. But I don't think that precludes other areas from interest, of course. Now there is a broader question, of course, of affordability, you know, from a more macro sort of healthcare perspective. But I think, you know, as Henry mentioned, I think in one of his slides, you know, the level of unmet need in oncology is obviously high, even in cancers that are relatively, you know, in inverted commas, well managed. So I think, you know, what this means for developers outside that space, I think it's difficult to say directly. Of course, there's a lot of money spent on those assets, those products in clinical practice because they've improved outcomes so well. So I think in other target markets, a similar thing could occur, surely, if products came along that improved outcomes in a similar way.
That's great. Well, gentlemen and our audience, we're up on time, unfortunately. I do want to thank our two panelists, Paul and Henry, and the support for this webinar from Evaluate and from BIO and from Inova. I'd also like to thank everybody who attended for attending and for your participation and your questions. There were 2 or 3 that we couldn't get to in the end, and I'm sorry for that. But as I mentioned at the outset, we'll be sending a link to replay this webinar to everyone within about the next 24 hours. And you should feel free to distribute the link to others in your organization who might be interested in the topics we discussed, the ones we covered, and anyone who wasn't able to make it today. I wish you all the best for your partnering endeavors for the rest of the Virtual Partnering Oncology event. And I look forward to seeing you all again at our events in March, in September, and in October this year. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful partnering event. Have a good afternoon.